Thank you all for coming, and it's a wonderful opportunity to speak with you all today, and I look forward to the conversation. Um, I guess I'll start with my remarks with sort of what got me involved in this in the first place and led to the founding of the commission. This began as a summer job for me. Um, I was teaching at Bowie State University at the time and was looking to do a research project with some students, because there was some funding available. And hey, it's always nice to have a little extra cash on hand. But it was really an opportunity to teach students how to do research. And I was at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum and saw the video that they have on the history of lynching in Maryland. And at the end of it, they began to roll the names, to mention the names and the counties where the victims of lynching in Maryland, happened. And when they got to Stephen Williams, Prince George's County, that struck me. It's like, wait a second, Prince George's County, that is in Bowie State's backyard. This needs further investigation. And so I talked with my students and we said, yes, let's look at the history of lynching. We sort of went at it initially hoping that we would be able to do full-on biographies of the victims of the lynchings. As we found out, just given the way that the stories were presented in the news media of the day, that was not possible. They did not give that kind of information. So as part of my charge to teach these students how to do research, the first thing I did was I took them to the Enoch Pratt Library and taught them how to work with microfilm, to look at the Baltimore Sun, which on microfilm goes back to the 1830s, to look at the Baltimore Afro-American. And then after that, we went to the Maryland State Archives and we started looking for documents. We went to the Library of Congress and looked at the NAACP lynching files. If you go to the main reading room, there are over 300 boxes of materials at the NAACP gathered on lynchings across the United States. And we went through the files dealing with Maryland. And over the course of that 6 or 7 weeks, we found about 40 cases that we were able to document, which was substantially higher than the numbers that the Tuskegee, Monroe work at Tuskegee had found. It was higher than the number that the NAACP had documented in its 30 years of lynchings. It was more than what Equal Justice Initiative had documented to that point. With the ultimate realization was we need to do more research. I mean, because if EJI had found as many new cases of lynching that hadn't been documented before, and yet they hadn't studied Maryland, and we found these, that meant we needed to do more research. And a quick summary of the things that we found 6 cases that had not been listed on the Maryland State Archives website, on the legacy of slavery, in the court of Judge Lynch. We found the names of several people who had been listed as unknown. And so if nothing else, we were able to, at least in some cases, give names or restore the names of the victims of lynching. Some of the other things that we found, what were the things that we found? First and foremost, Maryland is a southern state. Too many people that I've come across said, no, Maryland, it's a mid-Atlantic state, or folks from way down south say, nah, it's too northern. It's like, no. The way we treated African Americans, the way we started with slavery in 1642, the way we in Maryland lynched African Americans, marks Maryland as a distinctly Southern state. There is no two ways about it as far as I'm concerned. Um, as Carl Snowden, pointed out, um, you know, looking at the Eastern Shore, yes, I mean, we sort of have this notion that, well, it must be the Eastern Shore. They're backwards. That was the lynching shore, as the Afro called them. And we did, talked about that part of the piece that we wrote. We talked about the other lynching shore, where fully three-quarters of the lynchings that happened in Maryland happened on the west coast of the Chesapeake Bay. So we found that, and again, unlike most of the other states in the countries where lynching were a thing, most of the victims of lynching were charged with or had allegedly assaulted or attempted to assault white women. That was, certainly going back to, you look at Ida B. Wells' Southern Horrors, and she said the majority of actual lynching cases, had to do with something other than that, and that, saying that there was an assault was basically code for a clandestine consensual sexual relationship between a black man and a white woman. We call that, the brute Negro narrative. I mean, because inevitably it was the brute Negro who tried to assault them, and then, the righteous, posse went and tracked them down and, exacted this, what was supposedly, justice, for the ostensible victim of the alleged assault. And so, yes, when we had the soil collection for Howard Cooper, and that's where I met Will Schwartz, who started the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, I was happy to join in that work. But in the wake of the uprisings following Freddie Gray's death, which was in the wake of Eric Garner's murder in Staten Island, and in the wake of Michael Brown, as important as the memorials were, for me, it wasn't enough. I wanted justice. I mean, by training, I'm a historian of Africa and Southern Africa. And so the truth and reconciliation process that happened in South Africa was very much at the forefront of my mind. And, part of our research, we read Sherry Lynn Eifel's On the Courthouse Lawn, and she does talk about, well, what would a truth and reconciliation process look like if we were going to look at that for lynching in the United States? And so I took that idea to my delegate, at the time, Jocelyn Pena Melnick, and said, can we do this? And she said, tell me why we should. And I explained what the situation was, what the results of our research was. And she pulled out her cell phone, called the bill drafting office for the state legislature and said, talk to them, let's get something set up. And so that began the process that resulted in the unanimous passage of the bill and, its signing, into law that established this commission. And so my feeling on this, and, David, I love you. I love you like a brother. Those stories are important, but for me, what's important is getting justice for those victims, for their families, and for those communities that were literally shocked into silence by the horror of racial terror lynching. The way I described it, in my testimony before the House of Delegates was, imagine that you had 40 open murder cases. It's like the police knew who committed the crimes, but they arrested no one. The state's attorneys knew who was involved and who perpetrated the crime, but they brought no charges. In fact, in all likelihood, those police and those state's attorneys probably participated in the criminal act in the first place. So in that instance, or in those instances, and in those instances where the state government failed to provide justice, what should justice look like for those victims, for their families, and for their communities? Um, there has to be, you know, and as Dr. King said, justice too long delayed is justice denied. Um, in listening to Carl's description of the death of Henry Davis, you know, I'm, you know, brought to the death of Breonna Taylor. You know, like Henry Davis, she was shot and left to die with no one, you know, intervening in any way. You know, what does justice look like in that case? You know, her family just got a settlement, but did they get justice for her death? Were the perpetrators of her murder brought to justice and held to account? The other thing that came to mind, you know, listening to Carl was, you know, the other Christmas lynching, you know, of King Johnson on December 26th. Actually, it was 2:00 in the morning. So effectively, they went in to the jail in Brooklyn, which at that time was part of Anne Arundel County. King Johnson, who had allegedly, you know, killed somebody in an argument over a pool game, was brought to the jail in Brooklyn, which was left completely unguarded. So the mob literally walked into the jail unimpeded, took him out of his cell, and murdered him. You know, the other Christmas lynching. And, you know, David, you talked about, you know, 2020 being the year of revelation. And that brings me back to the good old, you know, the Dies Irae, the day of wrath, that day of reckoning. You know, and that day of reckoning, it's coming. It's happening. What's it going to look like? What will justice look like for these men who were murdered, for their families, and for their communities? And with that, I'll stop and thank you.
Nicholas, thank you so very much. Deneen Brown is a journalist, like her colleagues of almost 100 years ago, had the responsibility of recording in writing what she saw. Deneen, let's hear from you, please.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone virtually. I'm happy to see everyone is surviving in this unprecedented time that we're going through in the country. What I'd like to talk about briefly is the role of newspapers and reporters in covering justice and injustice in our society. Newspapers play a crucial role in democracy. Reporters write the first drafts of history. So what I want to do is I wanted to talk a bit about my reporting in a different part of the country, which led me here. In 2018, I flew to Kansas and ended up driving across the Cimarron Turnpike to Tulsa, where my father lives. I asked my father whether we might go have lunch on Black Wall Street. I knew the history, but had not seen it up close. So we go to Greenwood in Tulsa. We're having lunch in a cafe right on the main avenue of Greenwood. I had just completed a reporting assignment in Montgomery, Alabama, where I had covered the opening of the Peace and Justice Memorial, which some call the Lynching Memorial. It's a very powerful place to go. If you have a chance to go to Montgomery, do so. You will be walking up the memorial, you'll be confronted by these vertical columns that look very much like coffins. And the memorial was designed intentionally to confront the viewer in the face with the names of the men, women, and children who were killed in racial terror lynchings in this country. So I had just completed that assignment. I flew to Kansas, drove to Tulsa. I'm having lunch on Black Wall Street with my dad. I look around and I see that there's a minor league baseball stadium. There's a yoga studio. there's a burger stand, there's a new shiny apartment complex. And I say to myself, these are the signs of gentrification, which we know so very well in the DC area. And it was startling to me because this was the site of one of the worst incidents of racial terror, violence committed against Black people in US history. The Tulsa Race Massacre happened in 1921. More than 300 Black people were killed in cold blood. The town of Greenwood, which was so prosperous, it was called Black Wall Street, was destroyed. B.C. Franklin, the father of John Hope Franklin, writes a firsthand account of how airplanes dropped turpentine bombs on the houses of Black people who lived in Greenwood, destroying the community. It was the first recorded incident of a US city being bombed from air. This happened in Greenwood, Tulsa, Black Wall Street. So I'm there sitting in the cafe, see signs of gentrification. I think it's very odd that this building is happening on the side of a massacre. Come back to Washington, tell my editor, I begin writing the story about what happened in Greenwood and what's happening there now. The story lands on the front page. The very next day, there's a community meeting in Tulsa. The mayor's talking about development in North Tulsa. The Reverend Turner, pastor of Vernon AME Church, pulls up a copy of the story and confronts the mayor, saying that you would not be able to develop here this land had this massacre not occurred. At that moment, the mayor of Tulsa decides to reopen the investigation into what happened during the Tulsa Race Massacre, and also reopen the investigation into the search for mass graves. I tell this story because it shows that reporting, how crucial reporting is in society, and how important newspapers are in our society. Reporters are charged with pursuing the truth. Good reporters, in their role as reporters, are tasked with pursuing the truth. Reporters uncover wrongs, they hold power accountable, they ask questions, they uncover what is covered, they dig into documents, and they try to shed the light on what needs to be revealed to the public. So I want to pivot a moment to the lynchings in Maryland. And some of my research in Maryland, I've gone through and read accounts in white-owned newspapers of lynchings that occurred across the state. And in doing so, what I found is these reporters covering these lynchings in 1890, early 1900s, failed to perform their most basic duty as reporters. That duty is to pursue the truth and report the truth in their first drafts of history. What I found instead in these stories that ran in the Baltimore Sun and other newspapers in Maryland and across the country is these reporters were there at the time of the lynchings. Some of the newspapers actually advertised the time and place that lynchings would occur. So in this, newspapers and reporters failed to uphold their most basic duty to report the truth and write the first drafts of history. These reporters who were on the scenes of the lynchings failed to report the names of the perpetrators. they failed to report what happened. Instead, what I found is many of these reporters working for white-owned newspapers wrote about these barbaric acts of violence against Black men and women and children as though they were writing a screenplay. It's really awful to go back and read these stories in the archives and in public libraries, just about how the reporters wrote the story and the role that these newspapers played in racial terror lynchings. In the early 2000s, some newspapers in the South and other places across the country began issuing apologies for the roles that they played in the coverage of racial terror or in the lack of coverage of the civil rights movement. Poynter Institute, which is an institute that trains journalists, reported that newspapers in cities like Lexington, Kentucky, Jackson, Tennessee, Tallahassee, Florida, all acknowledged that they had failed to perform their duties as journalists. What I would like to see with as the commission goes about its duty in researching the lynchings that have occurred in our state of Maryland is that hopefully the commission can take a look at the role of newspapers in Maryland, the role that these newspapers played in racial terror lynchings, and perhaps these newspapers can open their archives and we can reach a point where maybe these newspapers issue apologies for the way they covered the stories, for the lack of information that was included in the reports that were printed and published, and perhaps apologize for advertising lynchings, which led to the deaths of dozens of Black men, women, and children. So it's my argument that newspapers and reporters in history failed to do their basic duties. And I hope that we can reach a point of reckoning, and newspapers across the state and perhaps across the country can look at the roles or lack of role in covering injustices and barbaric acts committed against Black people. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I want to remind the viewers who are watching, you'll have an opportunity to have your questions addressed. Please use the chat room as an opportunity to share any questions that you might have. We have one other panel member that will be making a presentation, and then we're going to open it up to a discussion that will involve the panel members themselves as well as the public. Before we get to that, here's Dr. Charles Chavis. Chavis is the next presenter. Charles?
Carl, I don't think he's arrived just.
Okay, let's move on, and when he comes, we'll enter him into the discussion if we can. I want to raise a question with the panel members. Each has asked a fundamental question: what is justice? And I'd like to have them respond each to that question. Deneen, you seem to suggest that justice might be beginning with an apology by media, particularly newspapers during that era. Nicholas raised the question of whether money, reparations in the form of settlements, is that a form of justice? And I'd like to have each of you, starting with David, address the question for lynchings in America and in Maryland. What is justice? What would we seek to do? David?
Ooh, okay. So I'll frame my response with starting with what I think are the low hanging fruit. So it starts with an apology. And I want to hear apology from the executive branch of government. So that's hearing it from the governor. I would like to hear it from the Maryland State Legislature. And I would like to hear it from whatever representation from law enforcement that there is, and the judiciary as well, to acknowledge the system's kind of compliance or allowance for these things to happen. And as we continue to uncover the history of lynchings, we know that a lot of times law enforcement encouraged it or certainly turned an eye, I won't even say a blind eye, just kind of turned away from it. So that must be recognized. I think it continues with memorializing where terror lynchings occurred, and I'm so glad that that has been happening and will continue to happen. One thing that I've said and will say to you all, so hold me to it and hold the commission to it, is the duplicates of the monuments at the, and I'm just calling it the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, I want them to be gone for the state of Maryland. Um, I want them to be prominent at the locations where lynchings occurred, or certainly uh, at the seats of the areas where lynchings occurred, particularly county seats where the lynchings occurred. If we're moving kind of up the chain of the hierarchy, it certainly needs to be taught. People need to know that this history exists. They need to know the connections between the history of the past and what's going on now. Uh, and I agree with Nick, and Nick and I are like that in many ways. It's like reparations. We know that this act was committed to preserve a system of oppression, and in most cases, money was the primary driver. So, what better way to bring some semblance of justice? Some, I'm not saying it is the answer, but some semblance of justice by providing reparations for the damage that was done, not just to the victim's family, but the communities in which these racial terror lynchings occurred. And then most importantly is the policy to make sure things like this don't happen again, and to make sure that the current iterations of lynchings cease. So when we talk about mass incarceration, when we talk about police brutality, when we talk about a subpar educational system, when we talk about the lack of economic opportunities, the lack of opportunities to build wealth for Black people in Maryland and people of color in the state of Maryland, yeah, that's, to me, that's the game changer. That's when the system and society really changes. So those are the things that bring justice for me, and allow for some semblance of reconciliation. And amidst all of that is the reconciliation, the healing that is necessary. People are learning things that they never knew before, and that takes time to process. And I understand that. And then the point is to show them why they needed to learn this, to make that connection to what's going on now. And if that in the past bothers you, what's happening now should bother you just as much, if not more. And let's work to make sure it doesn't happen anymore.
Thank you so very much. Before we go to the other panel members, Dr. Charles Chavis has joined us. Charles, we have given each of the presenters an opportunity to make an opening statement. And then after you have done your statement, we're going to go back to getting questions and having a dialogue, if you will, among the panel members. So Charles, welcome, and please share.
Yes, thank you so much, Commissioner Snowden, and thank you all for joining us. I'm so thankful to be here. Thank you so much for the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project for helping us pull this together. I really just want to echo some of the words of Chair Dr. Fakunle, specifically as it relates to the importance of understanding our work and the work of this commission as work that is so essential. And in terms of the overall larger picture, the orientation and focus towards justice is something that is equally as significant in my eyes in terms of this work. We know with other cases throughout the country, specifically with cases in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as well as in regions of Durham, North Carolina, we know that racial terror, the legacy of racial terror is something that needs to be confronted from an American perspective. And I think our work here is so important because we're leading the way as the nation's first commission. And I think it's not enough to really bring about truth. We also have to bring about some level of social transformation to not only the communities who suffered locally, but also to the state overall. And so those are some words that I just share. I don't want to take up the Q&A time, but I did want to say that prior to opening it up for discussion. So thank you again, and I look forward to taking questions from the public.
Charles, one of the questions has been raised, and I will ask you to respond and then ask others to respond as well. How do we deal with this dark side of history? It's, as many know, it's very emotional. It's tough. How do you deal with people who say, well, these incidents happened more than 100 plus years ago? How do you get justice now? Most of the victims are dead. Most of the perpetrators of these lynchings are dead. What do we hope to accomplish as we move forward in dealing with this dark side of history? Your response.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Snowden. So I think it's important for us to understand when we look at the legacy of racial terror in this country that, you know, these incidents that we're profiling and highlighting are part of a larger pattern within this country where marginalized communities, specifically communities of color, have been targeted with racial violence, right? And of course, today, you know, I feel like we're witnessing another phase of the freedom struggle, a very transformative phase where we have an uptick in the police killings that we've witnessed in this country, which is something that's really important for us to understand. And so when I think about the work of our commission in terms of uncovering and salvaging the humanity of these victims and these crimes, highlighting these crimes, we have to look at our work in connection to, in relationship to the ongoing and current and present assault on Black bodies that is taking place throughout this country. And so I see the historical work that we're doing as a part of the larger freedom struggle that we're participating in and should be participating in throughout this country.
Nicholas, as a historian, Charles is saying that we should connect lynchings to these unjust shootings that have occurred by law enforcement officials. Is that a proper connection between these lynchings that occurred, oftentimes without any judicial process, and the current shootings that take place that often do have a judicial review?
Yeah, in a word, absolutely. You know, I think one of the things that you know keeps striking me, you know, as I look at the lynching cases, as I look at what's happening in our day, is that, you know, and again, going back to the end of the Civil War, that the oppression doesn't end, it adapts, it changes with the times. You know, because before racial terror lynchings in the 1870s moving forward, it was the slave codes. You know, you had to stay, you know, it's like if you left your plantation without a pass, you were subject. And again, I mean, if we want to talk about, you know, sort of the statements that Black lives don't matter, let's take it back to, you know, the 3/5 compromise. Let's take it back even further to the implementation of those first laws that legalized, excuse me, racialized slavery. You know, and again, to think in terms of justice, you know, the question you had asked before, you know, again, I was raised Catholic, and so I remember, you know, for the apology that David had mentioned, you know, you go to confession, right? You know, the sacrament of reconciliation. And, you know, there were two things. You always had to do the act of contrition, and then there was penance. So you had to state formally, and again, the presumption was that you actually meant it, that you were truly sorry for having committed some sort of grievous act that was grievous enough to be considered sinful. And you had to do penance. You had to take some sort of affirmative action to try to show that effort at reconciliation. You know, and again, the scholar in me, I know in you know traditions of Judaism, you know, with Erev Yom Kippur, the night before Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, before you could approach God to seek for atonement, you had to make peace with those people that you had aggrieved. And so, if we're talking about justice, and is it possible to get justice for those communities? And I think David was pointing us in the right directions. How do we make amends to these communities that have been so grievously affected? Because those effects compound over time. You know, whether it's money, you know, whether it's, you know, creating policies that are going to undo, you know, the policies rooted in white supremacy, you know. And I saw that there was a question in the chat box. Those legal lynchings are not within the purview of the commission. That, I think, should be another commission in and of itself, because those numbers, and I haven't had a chance to quantify them, but those numbers escalate dramatically, you know, round about the turn of the century, shortly after the lynching of King Johnson. I mean, the number of legalized executions just go off the charts. And so that, I think, is another instance that merits further investigation.
Thank you. Deneen, you had talked about the notion of newspapers or the media in general taking the leadership and announcing that they were complicit in some ways with the lynchings that occurred. And you talked about there were newspapers around the country that had in fact done that. What was the response of those communities when newspapers made that announcement or that apology? You're muted.
Can you hear me
Yes.
now? I think those apologies brought some, I'm not going to say comfort to the victims, but anytime the truth is revealed or the truth is announced, there's a power that comes with uncovering the truth and recognizing the truth. And in this case, the truth is that many newspapers in this country played portal roles in these racial terror lynchings by advertising the lynchings and in their coverage of the lynchings, and by the reporters on the scene who failed to cover the entire story. Basic cub reporters know that when you go to the scene of in this case, the scene of a crime, you try to talk to everyone there. Talk to the sheriff, you talk to the people in the crowd, you talk to, and you get names. So what's missing from many of these articles that I've been reading about lynchings across the country is the names of the individuals who participated in the white mob. Why didn't the reporters get those names and talk to those people? That's a very basic duty that reporters are assigned when they're out covering stories. Get the identities of people, cover the scene, talk to people. And if you notice, there's a pattern in many of these stories is you get the name of the Black man or woman who was killed, murdered. You get the so-called accusation that led to this murder. And in many cases, the accusation is reported as though it happened, as though it was true. And according to the investigations and research by Ida B. Wells Barnett, we know that many of those accusations are false. Nevertheless, these mobs were not, this was extrajudicial killing. These mobs became the judge, jury, and executioner in that very moment. And the reporters at the scene are almost like accomplices to that. So I suggest that newspapers, perhaps across the country, get their investigative teams or their reporters to go back and try to uncover these stories that are are covered up and buried in their archives. Even though the stories are buried in archives, they're very much, the pain of what happened is very, very thick and palpable in these communities where these massacres, lynchings, horrible racial terror crimes happened. When you travel across the country, you can almost feel it. You can feel it in these places in Maryland where lynchings occurred, because there has been no redress for what happened. Researchers recently have talked about generational pain that people carry. Pain is passed from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. And I argue that this generation of Black people, we still feel the pain of our families, our friends, our loved ones who were impacted by racial terror. So again, I argue, I hope that we can address the issue of how journalism failed to cover these massacres and racial terror lynchings. And perhaps journalists today can go back and write those stories and help people understand what happened in our country, because so many people don't know that this happened. That we're living in a country where hundreds of people were killed in cold blood. So thank you.
Thank you. David, there are people who are watching tonight who are part of, who are activists, and there are people who are tuning in for the first time learning about the history of lynching in Maryland. But there are people who may have stories that they would like to share or incidents that they're aware of that the commission may not be aware of. How do they tell their story? Who do they contact if they have information on a lynching that they believe occurred in their jurisdiction?
So they are more than welcome to reach out to us, the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So while we are charged with focusing on the documented lynchings that happened between 1854 and 1933, we have been granted through the law some leeway to explore those lynchings that have been confirmed and verified. So part of what we want to do with this opportunity is to bring honor and justice to those names that we don't know, that perhaps are within the stories of the various communities in Maryland in which racial terror lynchings happen. So please feel free to reach out to us. We are accessible via our website, which you all will see at the end of this event. We are continuing to develop our protocols and measures to make sure that your stories are honored, whether you want to remain confidential, things of that matter. We want people to feel comfortable and trust us to honor those stories and honor the information that we want to share with fellow Marylanders and people all across the country and the world. But speaking personally, share it with somebody. Make sure that it's chronicled. These are stories that we know leave our existence every day, because there are people who transition having never told the story outside of their own homes or even told the stories outside of their own minds. So we hope that through this event and just through this year, people have become, first and foremost, fed up. And secondly, have activated their courage to tell these difficult stories that we know exist. We just don't know the extent to which they existed, but we know they existed. We know that there's history that is going unchronicled, and this is a golden opportunity to make sure that's not happening within the purview of racial terror lynchings in the state. So there are a number of platforms and opportunities and entities that you can go to make sure the stories are remembered. And we hope that people out there will trust us, the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to do the same with the power that we have been granted. So I mean this from the bottom of my heart. I personally don't care if we don't know as a commission, as long as somebody knows and as long as it's chronicled. I'm sure we'll get to it at some point as a commission, but as long as it's memorialized and remembered, that's the most important thing to me. Tell the story, tell the story, tell the story. And if you trust us, if you believe in us, if you think we will do right by the history of these acts, let us know, and we will make sure that it's memorialized as well.